Today on the Word Preacher podcast, records, welding links, and fight on. I'm Brett Jensen, and this is the Word Preacher podcast. All right, our Come Follow Me material for this coming week will take us to sections 125 through 128 in the Doctrine and Covenants. Let's go ahead and get started about talking about records. God cares about records. In fact, in the Book of Mormon, Jesus personally came to the Nephites and said, why haven't you made a recording of the prophecies made by Samuel the Lamanite about the dead rising and appearing to many? And they said, oh yeah, we didn't do that. He specifically commanded them that they do that. And it was done because he cared about records. The Lord commanded Lehi to have him risk the lives of his sons to obtain records, and then commanded them to make their own records. The Lord went to great lengths to make the records of the Bible accessible to people in their own languages. And now we kind of take that for granted, but hundreds of years ago, people gave their lives so that it could be written in English. The Lord went to great lengths to ensure that the Book of Mormon was translated and that these records were protected. And most of these records, even though the Lord made great efforts to do this, most of these records were written by imperfect people with imperfect writing. In fact, very few things that we have recorded were actually things that Jesus himself said. Many of it are experiences and things that were told kind of secondhand through his prophets and other witnesses who are imperfect. But we're commanded to make records anyway. Of course, the same is true of ordinance records. When we're thinking of the way that things are recorded, obviously great care is taken to try and make sure that things are accurate. But not taking any records is unacceptable. Here's what the Lord declared in section 127, verses 6 through 9. Verily, thus saith the Lord unto you concerning your dead, when any of you are baptized for your dead, let there be a recorder, and let him be eyewitness of your baptisms. Let him hear with his ears, that he may testify of a truth, saith the Lord, that in all your recordings it may be recorded in heaven. And whatsoever you bind on earth may be bound in heaven, and whatsoever you loose on earth may be loosed in heaven. For I am about to restore many things to the earth, pertaining to the priesthood, saith the Lord of hosts. And again, let all the records be had in order, that they may be put in the archives of my holy temple, to be held in remembrance from generation to generation, saith the Lord of hosts. Okay, so making records was vital to the Lord. We couldn't just be, oh yeah, I'm pretty sure they were baptized. It should be something that is done with care. It shows a proper prioritization of sacred things. Nephi deliberately prioritized Isaiah's writings, for example. Mormon, as he was abridging the records, prioritized the teachings of Alma the Younger and defenses set up by Captain Moroni, as well as the tragedies that were brought by dissenters and by workers of secret combinations. You should record things that are valuable in an effort to pass on the most important things to others. Now, this does not have to be in the form of traditional journals, although it can be. Photographs, videos, They can also show the prioritization of family and sacred things, pictures near temples, short videos of wholesome family recreation, and things that are virtuous, lovely, and praiseworthy. These can be valuable things. In fact, even writing poetry or fiction, creating stories. That's something that can be used to tell important truths about concepts in a memorable way. It was something that Jesus did himself. And of course, not just in a religious context. I, for example, am moved when I think about the friendship and loyalty of Samwise Gamgee for Frodo Baggins and The Lord of the Rings, a story that is an obvious fabrication. There aren't hobbits and elves and orcs, but it's a moving story, even though it's fiction, because of the applicability of the truths that it contains. And of course, there are other things you can do that are based in fact. Make a podcast, even if no one seems to be listening to it. You could find value in preparing and making it. Although, thank you for listening. In a world where trends are fleeting and priorities are shifting, your efforts to make something that endures can bring value to you and to those who come after. And it ties into our next thing that we're going to talk about, welding links. Here are a few verses from the subsequent section, 128, verses 16 through 18. And now, in relation to the baptism for the dead, I will give you another quotation of Paul, 1 Corinthians 15:29. Else, what shall they do which are baptized for the dead, if the dead rise not at all? Why then are baptized for the dead? And again, in connection with this quotation, I will give you a quotation from one of the prophets who had his eye fixed on the restoration of the priesthood, the glories to be revealed in the last days, and in a special manner, this most glorious of all subjects belonging to the everlasting gospel, namely the baptism for the dead. For Malachi says last chapter, verses 5th and 6th, Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And he shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse. I might have rendered a plainer translation to this, but it is sufficiently plain to suit my purpose as it stands. It is sufficient to know in this case that the earth will be smitten with a curse, unless there is a welding link of some kind or other between fathers and the children upon some subject or other. And behold, what is that subject? It is the baptism for the dead. For we without them cannot be made perfect, neither can they without us be made perfect. Neither can they nor we be made perfect without those who have died in the gospel also. For it is necessary in the ushering in of the dispensation of the fullness of times, which dispensation is now beginning to usher in, that a whole and complete and perfect union and welding together of dispensations and keys and powers and glories should take place and be revealed from the days of Adam even to the present time. And not only this, but those things which have never have been revealed from the foundation of the world, but have been kept hid from the wise and prudent, shall be revealed unto babes and sucklings, and this, the dispensation of the fullness of times. Okay, now some of these principles, we'll talk more about the permanence of bonds in our discussion next week when we focus on eternal families. But even without this portion of the subject, consider this thought experiment. Can you name who your parents are? Most people can. There's a few that have trouble with that, but most people know the names of their parents. How about your grandparents? Can you name all of them? This is, fewer people can do that, but this is still very common. The person can name all their grandparents. Great-grandparents is less common. For a person to be able to name all of their great-grandparents, that's not a common thing to be able to do. Great-great-grandparents is extremely rare. And eventually, even if you have access to records where you're able to read and check and not just recall them from the back of your mind, but diligently looking through records, you will eventually come to a place where you will find a hole in your family tree. You will not be able to identify someone. Now, even if you find a line that goes back really far, the integrity of records through the Dark Ages becomes questionable at best. And even before that, in ancient times, some of these things are just, we don't have records of many of the people that have lived on the earth. You come from a tree, obviously you're present, so you have to have a tree that reaches back. But there's a lot of gray area before you reach a mysterious beginning. Yet there is no doubt that the people lived in ancient times from whom you are descended. Obviously, you wouldn't be here if that were not the case. And it's also true that all the people that are now present are also children of God, as well as those who we do have records of in ancient times, including Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. These particularly made covenants that bind upon them and their posterity great blessings. But as we are, without some connection to them that's definitive, we're entitled to nothing. That's important. None of us are entitled to anything. Our connection has been lost. And if no one is connected to the promises that God swore to ancient prophets and their families, then the earth is no longer able to fulfill its purpose. In other words, the whole earth is then being worthy of being smitten with a curse, or as Moroni phrased it, being utterly wasted. It's like the tares in the field, or the olive trees that cannot bring forth good fruit. They are hewn down and cast into the fire. But what if there were a way to restore that which was lost? What if there were a way to take people with unknown links and weld them into the correct chain? Well, just as the gate at the head of the straight and narrow path is baptism, so too is the gate on the path that restores our connections to ancient covenants and blessings. Baptism for those who cannot receive baptism themselves. Baptism for the dead allows us to connect in a very literal sense with those who have passed on. An individual in possession of a body receives an ordinance on behalf of an individual who cannot themselves receive it because they have no body. That individual obviously can accept or reject this ordinance. It's not a forced baptism, but it is something that they are then allowed to receive, which otherwise would have been impossible. Now, of course, because this type of ordinance transcends death, it requires the abilities of the one who defeated death. We mentioned this briefly last week. We talked about how it should happen in his house, in the way he prescribes, and in his name, with his authority. When performed correctly, this creates a link. It welds and connects another individual into a chain. And we can see that the more of these links that are attached, we're continuing a restoration process. We're creating something, forging something that binds people across time. In fact, this is an important theme, that restoration is not a one-time event. That's true for the church. It's true for an individual seeking remission of their sins. It's true for families. Restoration should be an ongoing process. And it's the most important reason for even having a church. Organized religion helps us to find and solidify our full place in a complete family in which God is our Heavenly Father, and we are empowered to inherit everything that He seeks to give us. All right, last subject. Joseph Smith offers these words of encouragement. 128 verse 22. It's longer than that. It's worth reading the whole thing, but I'm going to stop at the first little bit of this verse that reads, "Brethren, shall we not go on in so great a cause? Go forward and not backward. Courage, brethren, and on to the victory." Now, as a lifelong fan of the USC Trojans, I love college football. I love it when we win so much. And it is painful when we lose. There have been many moments of soul-crushing defeat, and this season is one of them in particular. But there have also been many moments of overwhelming happiness. One of my favorites that I would like to talk about for a couple of minutes was the story of the 2017 Rose Bowl, in which number 9 USC faced off against number 5 Penn State. Now, USC started out strong at the beginning of the first quarter, going up 10-0. But Penn State refused to go away. Eventually, at halftime, the score was 27-21 with USC on top. The third quarter, however, was a disaster. It was an absolute disaster. It looked like USC was just going to roll over and get dominated by the Nittany Lions, who went up 42-27. But at last, towards the end of the quarter, we fought back. We got a touchdown and did kind of an amazing play between Sam Darnold, a quarterback, and a tight end to get a 2-point conversion. Of course, Penn State was not done fighting on their part either, and they went up 49-35. So still a big margin between the scores. USC refused to give up in spite of that awful third quarter and finally pushed into the end zone to make it a one-score game with about 7 minutes to go. Now, with a powerful running attack that had been quite successful, Penn State used a lot of clock, but the defense got a huge tackle for a loss on a 3rd down and 4 play with about 2 minutes left in the game. So Penn State had to punt. So the Trojans, in 2-minute offense mode, methodically worked down the field, big chunks thanks to great playmaking from quarterback Sam Darnold and receivers Juju Smith-Schuster, Darius Rogers, Deontay Burnett, and Imatorbhebhe, helping a couple of times with Penn State committing some serious pass interference penalties on our wide receivers, and also great plays that helped move the ball down the field in a short amount of time. And with 1.5 minutes left, just inside the 30-yard line, Darnold connected with Deontay Burnett between the Penn State defenders for a touchdown. A PAT tied the game at 49. Now, Penn State just needed to get into field goal range. And for a lot of that third quarter and even the second quarter, they had been successful in exploiting some matchups between some of their talented receivers and our defensive backs. Our top defensive back had kind of gone out with an injury, and so it brought them some success. And USC, who had been successful on offense to tie the game, now needed to fight on defensively. The players were exhausted, and they knew the home run capabilities of the Penn State offense. 2nd and 9, Penn State targeted a wide receiver, and our defensive back McQuay got his hand on the ball but could not intercept it. 3rd and 9. Penn State targeted the same wide receiver, but this time our safety McQuay jumped in front of the receiver, snatched the ball out of the air, and sprinted down the sidelines, getting out of bounds inside the 40-yard line. With 5 seconds left to go in the game, Matt Bormeister lined up for a 46-yard field goal attempt. He had already missed a couple of kicks earlier in the game, but as time expired, the football sailed between the uprights, winning the game for the USC Trojans. Now, hearing that band play Fight On for Ole SC, our men fight on to victory as we triumphed in that game was one of the most emotional moments I've ever had during any sporting event. I screamed until my voice was gone. My 2 fingers were up in the V for victory sign for at least another hour after the game. It was incredibly motivating and inspiring to see how, even when beaten down, my team had refused to quit. Fight on to victory was always the mindset, regardless of what happened last quarter, last game, or last play. And this is the type of mindset that we see in the prophet Joseph Smith here at the end of this section, in section 128. He had been abused by mobs and people who hated him in states all across the Union. The government of Illinois was actively conspiring against him. People who had claimed to be friends had betrayed him. And yet here he is, writing to the saints about the inevitability of victory. This is an attitude that I hope to be better at developing myself. Confidence in the Lord and his prophets, regardless of circumstances. Act and think as though his victory is inevitable, because it is. In the end, Jesus wins. Links that seem to be broken, a world that seems irredeemable, he will save it. Prioritize telling things, recording things, and telling things that tell the right story, that tell of the triumph of our King. We appreciate all the support for the Word Preacher podcast. Next week we'll be looking at sections 129 to 132, focusing on eternal families. There's a lot of stuff we did not cover in great detail in our reading this week. Please study that individually and with your family. And of course, as always, fight on.